This video is going to be about two individuals, Rupert Sheldrake and Jane Jacobs. Rupert Sheldrake is a scientist, Jane Jacobs was a public intellectual. Both of these individuals criticized the orthodoxies of their respective fields. Both pointed to the patterns of nature and what we may infer from them to support their arguments. And both challenge the assumptions we make when we conform to a perceived consensus. So I'm going to discuss some of the parallels that can be made between these two iconoclasts. Sheldrake is a scientist, a botanist, and the author of several books which question scientific materialism and offer an alternative perspective and hypothesis to the natural world. Jane Jacobs was a critic, author, and activist in the fields of architecture and urban planning. She died in 2006. Her most famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is built on a metaphor with nature, and she uses this metaphor to explain her own theories on how our cities and public spaces ought to be organized. In Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jacobs makes a comparison between 20th century urban planning and the obsolete practice of bloodletting. Bloodletting was a method of controlled bleeding with the intention of treating any number of health issues. There are many techniques involved in administering it properly, how to direct the technique to treat a particular ailment, and so on. Despite the organized etiquette of bloodletting, it was still false science, pseudoscience. Jacobs uses this analogy as an introduction to her argument because her critique of modern urban planning was not compatible with its most basic assumptions. She had to introduce her thesis by first pointing out that experts can be wrong and have been wrong in the past. Jacobs takes this stage of history just after the advent of the automobile in the 20th century. This was such a profound shift to the organization and circulation of a city's inhabitants, and it all happened too rapidly to be fully appreciated. For example, bisecting a community with a highway had no precedent from which the consequences could be fully anticipated. The advent of the automobile and the reign of Robert Moses in the development of New York City was the historical context from which Jane Jacobs made her most important contributions. She was a dialectical antithesis to Robert Moses' urban planning. She organized communities on all levels, from neighborhood to district to borough, against a number of proposed planning projects. If Robert Moses had his way entirely, the LIE, a highway that extends through Long Island, would bisect Manhattan and continue into New Jersey. There would also be a highway that cut through Greenwich Village, as well as Brooklyn and Queens. It would have turned New York City into a totally anonymous city. It would have needlessly destroyed the very neighborhoods that street transportation aims to serve. Her vision of a healthy city was unified with the concept now referred to as eyes on the city. This principle derives from the inferences made on the correlations between criminality, commerce, and foot traffic. Jacobs suggested that a city had to sustain a level of diversity of residential buildings, social institutions, as well as commercial enterprises, all within a relative proximity to ensure activity occurred throughout the day. With these different reasons for inhabitants to walk outside at different times of the day, a condition of self-surveillance would naturally be put into place. She explains this idea with an analogy to biodiversity and the health of an ecosystem. For example, the housing projects built in the post-war period in New York City would have an effect of amputating city neighborhoods from each other. If you think for a moment of lining up multiple residential buildings without any other institutions around them, residents would have to walk 4 blocks just to get a cup of coffee. More importantly, why would anyone walk through the projects if they have no reason to be there? Essentially, people will only be walking through during their commute to and from the projects. There would be, in effect, fewer eyes on the city during the course of the day. Now I'm going to switch focus back to Rupert Sheldrake, who is still alive and well, and I encourage everyone to look him up and check out his content on YouTube. Rupert Sheldrake established himself in the field of botany without any controversy, and then he began to question the assumption that genetics alone explained the development of form in organisms. This led him to develop a hypothesis of a field, a morphogenic field that influences the growth of organisms, much how a magnetic field influences objects in the physical world. Sheldrake suggested that this hypothesis may help explain many of the difficult problems of biology. For example, how pigeons find their way home, how Pacific Coast salmon return to the exact place they were born. The difficult problem of consciousness may also have a credible explanation if our brain operates more as an antenna, tapped into a field which extends beyond the physical boundary of the body. Sheldrake suggests that our feeling of being looked at may derive from a sense that detects the vision of the other without having to see or hear the presence of the other's gaze. Such a phenomenon requires a theory of consciousness that threatens the assumptions of a materialist point of view. His hypothesis was and is heresy to scientific materialism, and yet over the course of his controversial career there have been more scientists and philosophers of mind who accept his hypothesis as a possibility. Materialism remains the dominant scientific framework, and it holds that everything is reducible to matter. The phenomena of consciousness, for example, is an emergent property of neural activity. This is how consciousness is seen from the materialist perspective, and the prospects of understanding how such a phenomena could emerge from mere matter and physical activity are not very promising. This is one reason why it is described as the hard problem of consciousness. Sheldrake has suggested that life and consciousness is tied together in an invisible field. Sheldrake directs our attention to the patterns of nature, which appear in different scales. The observation of the solar system, or the inside of a cell, or a molecule, or a galaxy. In all of these cases, we observe self-organized systems. Which leads me to conclude with a quote by Jane Jacobs. Nature is prodigal with details, but parsimonious with principles. This thought brings both of these thinkers together. They don't overlap exactly, they come from different disciplines, but considering them together helps us see the elegance of their criticisms more clearly. And they're both really interesting people to read and check out. If you like this video, please subscribe, or just comment and let me know what you think.